Our 40-plus days of Lent are fast coming to an end as we enter this last week of Jesus' earthly life, the week that we call Holy Week. The first Sunday in Lent seems like a long time ago, with its story of Jesus' temptations in the wilderness. If you remember that story way back at the first of Lent, it told about the temptation to magically change the reality of his situation by turning rocks into bread and feeding his hunger. That story told of the temptation to seize control of all the kingdoms of the world, as our favorite action heroes would certainly do, and to force everything to go according to his plan. That story told of the temptation to be rescued from harm altogether by the angels of God. Jesus, of course, resisted every temptation. In the wilderness, he passed every test. And with flying colors, he came through what many have referred to in their own lives as the dark night of the soul. That's the way we started this 40 weeks. But it's the last line of that story, as Luke told it, that I want us to focus on right now. That line that says, when the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. And I want us to focus on that line, because today, at Palm Sunday, as we begin this Holy Week, the Passion of our Lord, it is that opportune time. That opportune time where Jesus would be tested again. In the stories of Holy Week, as Jesus faces all of the events of that week, we need to remember that he must have faced the same temptations that rose up for him in the wilderness. The temptation to magically make the circumstances change into something else. Change for the better. The temptation to forcefully make the people behave as they ought to behave. To keep that Palm Sunday glorious feeling instead of that spiral down that we already now have in the middle of this liturgy, as we hear what the same people who shouted Hosanna were capable of shouting when they shouted, "Crucify him." The temptation to escape the situation altogether, either as he had escaped other times when they tried to kill him by simply walking away, not going there, or by calling down all the angels of God, the heavenly armies, to take him out of danger. A person would not be human without being tempted in these three ways, without being tempted to find some way to prevent what was to happen. And as we affirm in our creed every single Sunday, we believe that in Jesus not only did the fullness of divinity dwell, but also that the fullness of humanity dwelt there also, temptations and all. And as we continue this week, we will hear that that very night in the garden when he's arrested, he has been praying that perhaps that cup would pass him and he would not have to go through the week ahead. But to give in to any of these temptations, it would have helped him to avoid death on the cross, but he would have lost some of the integrity of who he was as God's chosen, as the Messiah. Each approach would have given him a chance, though, to live out a normal human life. And it would have been easy to see that living out a normal human life, rather than just 3 years of public ministry, might have been an opportunity to do a lot of good. But then what is a normal human life? There are those who would tell us that the normal human life is one in which we aspire to never hunger for anything, where we make sure we have enough so that we're never hungry. There are those who would tell us that a normal human life is one where everything happens according to our plan, and if it doesn't, we just need to plan better. And there are those who would tell us that where humanity is where we are always delivered from pain and tears, death and loss. But I would venture to say that not one of us here has ever arrived at that kind of normal? Have we? Have we ever arrived at the kind of normal where there was never anything we hungered for, physically or spiritually, emotionally, relationally? Have we arrived at that kind of normal? Have we arrived at that kind of normal where things happen according to the way we planned them, where we're never surprised by anything, where things don't change, where we get everything exactly right, and that's the way we live out the rest of our days? Are any of us living that kind of normal right now? Have any of us been able to live a normal that is completely free of pain, physically or otherwise? Free of tears? Never to having to experience death of any kind or loss? Have any of us ever arrived at that kind of normal? I venture to say no. Because life itself, from crib to grave, involves hungering and yearning for things that we do not completely have. And life from crib to grave is never conducted according to our plan. It always includes varying degrees of unpredictability, some pleasant, some not so, some downright horrible. And from crib to grave, each time we are willing to risk loving someone, we also become vulnerable to pain and to tears. Each time we are willing to risk living, we also leave ourselves exposed to the impact of death and loss. It's a part of life, from crib to grave. Those dark nights of the soul that come when we don't get what we hunger for, that come when things don't go according to plan, that come when we suffer grief and loss, pain and tears. Our temptation may be in this life to chase after magical promises or to create our own corners for control or to construct the walls we think will keep us safe from ever having to experience any of these things. But eventually, no matter how many walls we construct, no matter how much we isolate ourselves and try to control our own little worlds, eventually we'll come face to face with realities that we can neither change, nor control, nor blindly avoid. Eventually we will all come face to face with situations and circumstances that we just can't skip over or wiggle out of. Harsh realities that we simply have to find our way through. In Holy Week, Jesus doesn't rescue us any more than he rescues himself. But in Holy Week, Jesus shows us the way through. In Holy Week, Jesus shows us the way through and takes us there himself. Leads us by the hand if we're willing to walk through him, with him through his story, so that we can recognize him when he's walking with us through ours. See, this is not a way that can be explained. It's just a way to walk. It's a way to walk as we look at and listen to what Jesus does during this Holy Week. And maybe more importantly, to what Jesus does not do during this Holy Week. It's a way to walk as we look and listen to what he has to say to his own circumstances and realize how what he has to say to his circumstances somehow touch what we might say to the circumstances of our own lives. It's a way to walk that's revealed as we walk the way of the cross with him this week. It's a way that will be revealed in the actions we'll take on Maundy Thursday evening when we gather here. See, these things are not just so we can be busy this week, marking time till the Easter Bunny comes on Sunday. These are times for us to walk through the reality with Jesus that is the same reality that we walk in a normal life, just intensified in his, so that we can learn from him and see how to walk through ours. And so when we gather on Maundy Thursday evening, it runs us through that whole gamut of the way to walk. We start with the agape meal at 6. That meal is not just something extra like having fellowship hour tacked on before the service instead of after the service. That meal is a part of the whole thing. It reminds us of that meal he brought his disciples together with right before all this happened. It reminds us, agape being the Greek word for love, of those meals that continued in the Christian tradition from the Jewish tradition. Meals where everybody brought something and shared it together, sharing in the love for Christ. And so we'll do that with that agape meal. We'll use different foods than we normally bring. We won't bring a lot of meat and potatoes and green beans like at a potluck. We'll bring the kinds of some of the Middle Eastern things that people would have had. We'll have the chicken matzo ball soup. We'll have grapes and cheese, pita bread. We'll drink cups of wine, using blessings that the early Christians might have used over the wine and the bread and the foods as they had their agape meals. Don't miss the agape meal at 6. Don't just come at 7. The agape meal starts it. It reminds us of the fellowship and the community that we all have no matter what goes wrong. And then we move from that into this service in here, from that love meal. And we recall the new commandment that he gave to his disciples and to us. Disciples meaning all who would follow after him. The commandment to love one another as he loved us. The only commandment Jesus ever gave. The only one he ever gave. To love each other in the same giving way that he has loved us. And we'll read about the servanthood that he symbolized by getting down on his hands and knees and washing his own disciples' feet. We'll read that story and remember that love always includes servanthood. And then we'll experience, after all of that love and commandment, we'll experience the starkness of Judas's betrayal, of Peter's denial, of all the disciples scattering. Because when that love got too hard, they just couldn't do it. Just like us sometimes, when love gets too hard. And so we're going to run through all of those emotions as we walk with Jesus that night. Some say it's their favorite service after we strip the altar. Some say they can't stand to come to that service. It hurts their hearts. Well, my friends, the whole purpose is to get to your heart. And all of those events of that night. And to get to the heart of the story that Jesus lived. And the story that we all live in one way or another. We come back the next day on Good Friday. A day to pay our respects to Jesus. How many of you here, if somebody that you knew and cared about in the community died, and there were visiting hours, how many of you would simply not go at all because you just had something else to do, or you were too busy, or you'd already come the night before to something you weren't going to come back? How many of you, for a very dear friend or loved one, if we had visiting hours, would you not be here? That's what Good Friday's about. We put a stark wood cross there that's empty, that reminds us of what happened. We hold visiting hours from 7 in the morning to 7 at night, trying to make sure we have at least one person in the church. At 10:30, we have a morning prayer service for any that come for that hour. At 6 o'clock, we end the vigil with the Liturgy of Good Friday, remembering that whole way of the cross. It is the way we pay our respects to somebody we love. If you're willing to walk those ways, it won't be comfortable. But it will be meaningful. And it will show you a way to walk the dark nights of your own soul. So you're invited to walk this way this week. You're invited to come and look and to listen to what Jesus did and to the ways he did it. You're invited to come and see and hear. Because somewhere, in the dark nights of these Holy Week services, we are able to identify the temptations that must have been his. And somewhere in these dark nights of Holy Week, we're able to recognize many of these same temptations as being our own. The temptations to just want it to change, the temptations to want to avoid it, the temptations to want to think if we can just control it enough, we'll never have to have a dark night of the soul. But in the dark nights of Holy Week, we're shown the way. The way that with him by our side, we can walk through our own darkness into the bright dawning of Easter morning.